It is finally upon us. After months of theorizing, Rage of the Abyss has come, and with it, the most impactful card that has likely come out in years. Molcharmy Fuelos. There is no doubt in my mind the game has been changed drastically with this card being introduced. And thus, I think it is only natural that I create a new tier list, explaining what I feel like the best deck is going to be in the wake of this new release. Now, just like we usually do, the tier list will be broken up into a few categories. The driving forces, decks that are well positioned, decks that are neutrally positioned, and decks that are poorly positioned. And at the time of recording this, Weiss's Niagara has not happened, but it should be when this video comes out. So it'll be interesting to see if my predictions or my thoughts have come to fruition, or something entirely different has happened with the first set of major events. Now, before I get into the actual tier list, if you guys are enjoying the content, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on what decks you expect to see in each of these tiers. As well, if you have any differing thoughts throughout any of my explanations in the entire video, then feel free to let me know. I'm always curious to see what you guys think, because I'm one person and mistakes happen. I would definitely be not the first time that I have misjudged a deck, or I've just forgotten to put a deck on the tier list. And with that, let's start us off with the driving forces. So this one isn't a deck, it's just Fueros. I want to talk about immediately what I think the impacts of this card will be. Now, I think in the extremely immediate sense, we'll see a drop off a bit in combo decks. People will be kind of adverse to dealing with this card from a combo perspective, because there are many games from a combo deck like Snake Eyes or Yubel where you get max seed and you kind of just lose. You can play some cards to stop it, but it's still going to be some bit of comparing hands. Now, the thing is, we've seen in the OCG that this doesn't stop the higher engine deck from being the better deck in most cases. My approach looking at Fueros is going to be looking at almost analogous to Maxi. And while they aren't identical cards and there are differences in them, like if you get Maxi, not being able to Maxi them back unless you clear your own field, as well as not being able to set up a board and use it, then I still think it makes enough difference in the format where like going first decks are kept at curve a bit, or kept at bay. And then there's also the thing where it doesn't net as many draws in some matchups. So you'll see some of the decks I mentioned here are decks that are okay into Maxi or not great, but they actually function just fine as a Fueros. My opinion is that it should be in everyone's main decks, if you can afford to play it, of course. I know some players may not hold that opinion. Some people saying that there's too much tempi in order to main deck it, and that it existing means there'll be more slow decks that shouldn't be played, or too much of a brick going first to incorporate it in. I think all those things are not worth it, and just how powerful it is going second will kind of demand that it takes a spot in the main, and at least for Niagara, my deck has it in the main. There is no ifs and buts about that. But we are expecting the format to slow down a bit, and the other big thing with Fueros and Maxi type cards is, like Mash Duel, you'll know there are a lot of games you just lose in the spot to this, and it makes the game more volatile, but also it like flattens out matchups a bit. What I mean by that is if you're playing a worse deck versus a top tier deck, the chance of you winning is pretty low because their deck is just better than yours. But with Maxi in the formats, you could just auto win by activating that one card, and what you're getting out of that is just stealing wins. So what happens is decks that would have otherwise a higher win rate kind of get lowered a bit, and you won't see decks have such crazy high win rates as you may have seen before, and it leads to more diverse formats. And that's a prediction, but I think that explains a fair bit of some of the stuff that happens in Japan and OCG, and why I can see some such random stuff topping, especially the locals, which is what Road to the King stems from, right? Only 4 or 5 round tournaments. Someone who's drawing Maxi every round can definitely just get away with murder almost. Moving on to the actual decks, though, the first deck I want to talk about is the deck that is arguably the best. Now, the next two are both kind of interchangeably the best, but with no doubt in my mind will shape the rest of the format around them. First up is Snake Eyes. So Snake Eyes has fallen off in the last little bit, and I wrongly predicted it would be one of the best decks last format. Now, truthfully, I feel like it was underexplored, and it required some innovation in order to get to the right position. I feel like rank 4 Snake Eye decks were the way to play it, because you needed more ways to get your engine going in light of hand traps being able to stop you. And that's partially what my Crystal Beast cards did. But with the Asmina cards, we no longer have to worry about that, because now we have more ways to access the engine, as well as you have Omni Negates to push through hand traps and help you play through fields. It kind of makes up for the deck's loss in consistency and loss in power. Like Apo being gone doesn't matter as much anymore, and the deck is just really good. Necroquip into Caesar and the Desiree lines still exist, and they're still good. The new Lacrima does also help Fiends with cards better in the grind game, like way better, to be honest, because it's more Fiends Engraved, but also like on your opponent's turn, if you're getting into a hand trap war, being like Lacrima effect, shuffle back, summon Requiem is like pretty nasty. I mean, you're just firing off like every strong engine in the game kind of in one deck, and that's what this is. It's good. It's a very good deck. Your end field is good. The deck is consistent. It plays through hand traps well. We're pretty much at where Snake Eye was, this in my opinion, at least similar to around the WSQ format. Now, when this deck is Furos, it does hit pretty hard. The Fiends with the cards in particular, I feel like kind of just suck into Furos, where other decks can kind of get away with maneuvering around something from the extra deck and from the deck as much. Snake Eye cards can do a little bit with like IP, but having to go like Requiem and then summon Engraver, then Necroquip, then make Caesar, I think that's like 4 draws. That's terrible. I think like that engine is particularly kind of rough into Furos, but there's no doubt in my mind, this deck is very good. It will do well. But even with Max C in the game, this format will not be slowed down to a complete halt, and the Snake Eye menace will continue to terrorize everyone. Now, at its foil, the deck that kind of opposes Snake Eye and another driving force, but also arguable best deck, it is Tempai. Tempai is brutal right now. Being able to play 9 just insane cards, being the 6 Chummies and the Shifter, really just gives you a lot of edge for going second. And then even without those, if Tempai doesn't draw those, they'll have other cards in their hand to pair with their little dragon guys that'll turn into the Trident Dragon that eventually will end you. However, my biggest problem with Tempai, and I think what holds it back from being the best deck, is unlike Snake Eye, this deck is a lot easier to prepare for. This deck has silver bullets. Cards like Barrier, Daruma Cannon, and just more actual trap cards really help you fight against Tempai. And when this deck is extremely anticipated and you're expecting it to be this dominant threat, more so than it has been probably ever, you will prepare for it. Myself, if my Niagara deck hasn't posted by now, you'll see it is very much built with the fact in mind I will likely play a lot of Tempais. And if you aren't prepared for Tempai going into this format, you are going to get obliterated. This deck is stronger than Snake Eyes when unopposed, like by its raw power, I think, at least right now. But it's also easier to kind of neutralize. I think by that metric, it holds it back from being the best deck, but it is a fantastic deck because it can play all the broken non-engine cards. Dominance Impulse 2 is another fantastic card that is now going to be in the deck. And I think that card really helps you in grind games or in value games where other hand traps don't work, or to push through cards like IP. It just destroys IP. I don't know what else there's to say. Like, Tempai is just magnificent right now. And not looking forward to it being such a heavily represented threat, but we will have to deal with it for now, and hopefully the Year of Fire with this Tempai and Snake Eye crap kind of just ends soon. Now, the last deck I want to talk about is a Driving Force. It's kind of a conglomerate of decks, but I'll confine it to the one that I feel like is the best right now, and that is kind of mid-range decks. So out of this Max C whole situation, right, with Furos, I think a lot more players will gravitate towards decks that aren't going to instantly lose when Furos resolves against them. And this lets you cope a little better versus Tempai, as well as going first with other decks, and then usually these decks also can fit in a large number non-engine to play going second versus the other decks. And we see these decks do better in National and in OCG than they do in the TCG. So I think that same concept will continue to translate over here, where these decks will see a rise in playability and popularity, especially as people don't have to deal with what we call maxi mini game. We'll call it what do you want to call it? The little chirping bird mini game, or the Fua game. Anyways, the deck that I think though is probably the best of that is Centurion, a deck that we've seen done pretty well win rate wise in National, even if its popularity is not the highest. And I think it gets kind of pushed forwards too by the fact that, for one, Maxi is better than Furos is against Centurion. Centurion kind of just does like nothing in the Furos and doesn't have to do much about it. In fact, you're better off Furosing your own turn for the draws of Crimson Dragon and then Blazer, the 2 draws there, which is like not the worst, but it's minimal. Also, you got the new cards between Infinite Forbidden and Rage of the Abyss. There are new cards for the deck to work with. For one, the biggest thing is another tuner. I'm not familiar with the names of all the Centurion cards, so I apologize in advance. But the new Centurion tuner out of Infinite Forbidden is good because you can stop Primaris from summoning itself out, and the normal summon is gone. The deck just kind of loses access to tuners. It means the deck has a weakness to removal oftentimes. Cards like SP can be pretty brutal. But the addition of another tuner means that extenders like Emblema Oath and Stand Up Centurion are more effective. But that's not all, because we've also gotten the new Synchro monster that's level 8, meaning it's now splashable with more other engines to get something more meaningful done. The card is completely generic, so engines like Super Heavy can work with it, and it just searches for any Emblema card on summon. So it's going to get you Emblema Oath, which is kind of insane. The deck, I think, is better now than it ever has been for card pool reasons and circumstantial reasons for the decks around it. Cosmic Blazer is also just one of the best cards in the game. I know Calamity is just broken, and Calamity is still the better card that turns off all your opponent's things. The Cosmic Blazer Dragon is still just fantastic, especially against mid-range decks or decks that can't kill you, because you'll get the negate. But even if it's negated, even if your opponent like droplets, Dark Rulers, or imperms this Cosmic Blazer, because it bans just for cost and it's a separate effect to return, it'll just come back every turn. And the constant 4,000 uber flexible Omni negate, because it can negate summons as well, is overwhelming for so many matchups. And I think if you're playing any grind game based matchup, with like two mid-range decks. Like say, like I don't know what another example could be. Voiceless Voice and Centurion. I'm not actually sure how this matchup plays out, but I think the constant pressure that Centurion can apply is so much better. As well as the protection effects is really nice from like Auxilia and Tridea, meaning you're like pretty sturdy into board breakers and it'd be hard to force out your stuff. Now my issue with these decks, I think they won't just be a dominant threat, they won't be the best deck. For one is, even if you aren't losing to Furos or Pirelli or Shifter as much against Tempai, the Tempai engine becomes better against you. And if you don't have the right non-engine equipped with you, then you'll just still lose, right? Valor Imperms can just do nothing and you might just get smoked. And you can prepare for this heavily on the side, which is what I expect to happen. That's what I'm doing from the Snake Eye perspective. Now, the other problem is versus combo decks like Snake Eye, Yubel, and the sorts. I think that if you go first, you're not going to have like Maxi to back you up like you do in Mashable or in the OCG. Furos will not be usable in those positions. So you're relying on just your hand traps and a bit of a small few interrupts. And Snake Eye has gotten more powerful with the Azamina cards now. Its ability to push through fields and to make aggressive shows of combos only increased. And I think versus mid-range decks, you can very legitimately just lose to Snake Eye's engine like pretty easily. The deck is not some invoked level normal summon Alistair get impermanent pass type shit. It's like Ash, then Wanted, then Bonfire, then the Azamina cards, then the Engraver. Like they have the potential to pop off pretty nastily. You may be equalizing the feelings you're having as a player, where like you're not going to feel the highs and lows of Maxi being used against you. And not having to like scramble when that happens, but you'll also just lose games where any other normal deck should just win because you get to go first uninterrupted type of thing. Anyways, those are all the driving forces for now. Now I do think Centurion is an entire bit worse than Tempai and Snake Eye, but I think it's the best of these mid-range type strategies, at least right now. That's what I think, and I will have more of those type of decks throughout the tier list, but I wanted to get out of the way how I feel like those type of decks will be driving force that you should be prepared for and expect to be played in a fair bit of popularity. Moving on to some well-positioned decks. The first two are both going to be combo decks, fitting into similar roles that Snake Eye has, although not as popular or as, I guess, defining. First one is Snake Eye Fire King. So with the release of Volcanics, this deck gets a lot better. It's better laying your interrupts now because you can really actually use the rank 8 on your opponent's turn reliably and effectively. You can search Kieran a lot easier. You can make plays through Nibiru a lot easier with the Photon Lord number 90. The Fire King cards can stand on their own two legs a lot easier with Volcanics being out. Now, comparing this deck versus the Snake Eye Fiendsmith deck is you will likely have less room for non-engine, as the Fire King engine is a lot heavier than the Fiendsmith engine. However, in return, I think it is better into fields, as well as you play off the field better. So, like, if you get board breakered, you feel a lot more comfortable. So versus Tempai, if you get, like, Hyrilliad or whatever, and you want to give them a couple draws, you're not going to then lose to the Lightning Storms and Regekis they're throwing from the hand off of those draws. As well as I think getting to use Dominance Impulse is a huge plus. It helps you in a lot of matchups and just gives you another impactful trap card. We've kind of seen this deck being one of the best decks, if not the best deck in Mashable for quite a while now. So it'll be interesting to see that with the Fiendsmith cards, how it stands up to those. In the OCG, it seems that the Fiendsmith cards are superior, but I really like the Fire King cards, and I think they will have a solid chance to shine. I also think they play a little bit better in Furos, where you can go give them like 1 or 2 draws to go Princess or Vod with like a Runics Engrave, which, don't get me wrong, it's not brilliant, but it's a lot better than what I think Snake Eye can put up under the circumstances, like in the pure Snake Eye sense. Pure. Anyways, the next combo deck to talk about is Yubel. So Yubel has not disappeared, and this deck was, without a doubt, the best deck of the last formats. But now with the card change in card pool, the Maxi hits this pretty hard, right? Because you are going to summon from the extra deck, and you are going to be summoning off some Sardi Lotus, and the Fiendsmith cards are all rather brutal. So I think it leaves Yubel in a bit of a weirder position than it was before, but keep in mind the core tenets of this deck, the really good reason why it was strong, is combo pieces haven't gone anywhere. And if we're comparing this format to OCG, it's important to remember they don't have those 2 fusion monsters, Necroquip and Aerial Eater, and it largely changes how Yubel functions. It cannot be understated how integral of a piece those cards are in shaping that deck. So I do think this deck is still solid, right? And I know for a couple people who were thinking of what decks to play for Niagara, I've been telling them if you're comfortable with Yubel, just stick with Yubel. I think it's still fine. The Furos problem is a problem. Hope is not entirely lost for Yubel when it comes to dealing with Mulch Army. Just like when you get Maxied in Mashable, there are game plans where you just go Phantom Pass, and if you back it up with hand traps, you'll live and then kill them the next turn. As well as, unlike Maxi, you have the ability to go second and still OTK with your Yubel shenanigans pretty easily, and they can't do anything about it because Furos not usable. But also something you can do is if people are holding Furos for you to threaten a special from the extra deck or from the deck, especially if they don't know what you're playing. So if you have like 2 Yubel, Spirit Yubel, and Beckoning Beast, you can just go first action, all right, throw back the 2 Yubels, throw Phantom on the field. Now, it's not without risk. Obviously, you can become weaker to Imperm and such that way, but it's a way of mitigating Furos, and you shouldn't assume that Furos existing eliminates the entirety of Yubel's capacity to play. The deck is still very powerful, and even if it's not going to be the forefront of everyone's kind of mind at the moment, don't discount it. It's not bad. Now, next up on this list of well-positioned decks is another combo-ish deck, but it is a big difference because it's not one that gets kind of brutalized by Furos, and that is Branded. Branded is a deck that has done well constantly in Japan and Master Duel, largely in parts because it's incredibly powerful, but also when you get Maxied, or now in this case Furos, the deck can make half boards that are a lot more competent and functional than other decks' half boards. Mirror Jade is an insane card, and if your opponent's not playing a combo deck, they're playing a mid-range deck like Centurion, for example, playing through the Mirror Jade is rough because that card floats, it's constant follow-up, it's immediate follow-up, and it's the like premium removal, non-target banish. So the cards just function incredibly well, and if you playing this mid-range deck in Maxi or Molt Charming them, and they give them 2 draws just to make Mirror Jade on you, like, you're not even that set, to be honest. Like, you're still kind of in a rough spot. I think that really works to Brandon's favor, and why we've seen it being hit so much in the parallel formats, OCG and Master Duel. I'm truthfully not very well versed in how this deck fares into Tenpai, and I think that's a large factor in how well this deck can do. But I feel like your Snake Eye matchup is fine. You can play Breakers to push through stuff, and Omnis included. And the deck should be super competent. I think this deck is a very good sleeper pick for upcoming events that's not talked about enough, because it's pretty good into Molt Charmy, into hand traps. It's consistent for the most part. I mean, it's still Branded. Now, there are some downsides to this deck. For one, if people are prepared for Tenpai by playing D-Barrier, then you get caught in the crossfire pretty bad. The same goes for Yubel. Yubel can play more under Barrier, but still sucks under Barrier. And then the other thing that sucks as well is Dominus Impulse existing. If Dominus Impulse is everywhere in the game, that card does beat Branded Fusion. So it's like having 3 more copies of Ash Blossom in the deck, which is rough. Not thrilled about that. So with all that in mind, I do think that Branded is still a good option, and it's well positioned in the next format. But whether it's like top tier or has potential to be an absolute top tier deck leaves a little to be seen. I think it is fine though. But the last deck that I feel like is well positioned is another deck that kind of gets hit 0 by Furos, and that is Fluanderies. Yes, all you bird fans rejoice. You guys love this deck. I feel like it's so like polar, like, I don't know, it's so conflicting. You have two sides of the spectrum and people hate each other over it. You either like birds or you hate birds. I personally don't hate it as much now that Statue's banned, but I cannot stand Shifter and Featherstorm. I actually think the Flu engine itself is kind of cool. I think the trap card Dreaming Town is just nuts and super interesting, but not a fan of the Floodgates. Anyways, yeah, so I think this deck is pretty good because the new Furos does effectively nothing against you. And even Parolia, there are ways to play around it by just summoning more on the opponent's turn. This deck does bully a lot of other mid-range decks because you get to just constantly play on both players' turns in a way they can keep up with. And you accrue advantage so quickly that unless they're overwhelming you and killing you, you just don't care. But even versus combo decks, you have the ability to book their whole field, set up the M-Pen, which is great versus Link monsters, or do Ryza and Avion things that can keep a lot of decks off. Now, the Tenpai matchup, according to Bird expert ornithologist Emery, your world champion, is that it's not great. So I guess part of the improving this deck would be finding a way to make that matchup better. Although their matchup would kind of slightly improve now that they are playing cards like Shifter and Furos for sure in the main, because those are cards that do nothing in that matchup. Like, they hurt Tenpai more than they hurt the Flu player. But no, I think Flu's fine in that regard. It does have decent going first boards. When it goes first and pops off, deck is solid. It's more consistent now as well as Kaori as well. And unlike in the other formats like OCG Master Duel, you're not hit as hard, right? Because you have more pots and you have more maps. And then also you get to play Shifter, and Shifter's just broken. Even if it's versus Tenpai and does nothing, like having Shifter for the other decks is just so criminal that I think this deck is a fantastic spot. As well as, let's not forget that we can also side in one of the most dumb cards ever printed, Harpy's Featherstorm. And who doesn't love not being able to play the game? Because Flu will make sure that's the case with you. Now let's move on to some of the neutrally positioned decks. And as these kind of fall in my standing as how good I think they are, I will get through them a little bit faster, especially the ones that are less unique because they are similar or analogous to another deck. And the first one I want to talk about is something that is rather new, and I guess it's completely new. It's from Rage of the Abyss, or the support from Rage of the Abyss, and the dynamic of the deck is greatly changed. And then it's Mermails. So this deck did nothing in Japan, but I think that is largely because there's a different card pool. It's important to remember when we look at the two formats that Totally Awesome is banned in Japan and in Master Duel. Bahamut Shark and a Toad is not a play that those decks have access to. And if you've messed around with this Mermail support at all, you'll know this deck can summon 2 to 3 Toads on the first turn every single time. That's crazy. And the fact that those are the differences between the formats is huge. It means you have a way more robust and actual powerful end field in the TCG version of the deck because it gives you better follow-up, gives you better negates. I mean, that's it, but that's it's like everything. Also, Furos, while still good versus deck, is not as criminal as Maxi is. If you aren't familiar, we did kind of look at this deck on the highlight channel, so go take a look because there are a lot of new support cards from this set, not just the Mermail cards, but also Virtue Stream and the Virtue Dragon that do give this deck more life. It can play some powerful breakers to break the board going second, and going first, it has an extremely high ceiling. So I don't think this deck can really keep up as much with Yubel and Snake Eye. Its combo potential is still up there, and it's a deck that I do not want to be underrated because it's not weak. And I would not be surprised remotely if this deck sees some minor success over the next few YCS. Next up, we're going in the opposite direction, and we're going back to traps. We got Labyrinth. So Labyrinth is a deck that I've seen being talked about a fair bit as a way of not dealing with Furos. It's kind of the immediate like gut reaction option because obviously you just don't give them draws off this card. And this deck was arguably in a good position before this. However, I think Labyrinth kind of has two options. It has the Trap Lab version and the Furniture version. The Trap Lab version is only ever existing as an anti-meta deck. It's entirely circumstantial. Its existence and success will entirely depend on the meta around it. And I think its kind of ability to play into Yubel, as well as be good versus other slow decks, is what made the Cannon Lab deck be good. I think the deck is, as the Math Lab deck is way worse into Snake Eye. And if that deck sees a resurgence, then I don't want to play Math Lab. That's the Furniture version. You are still weak to cards like Valor, Imperm. Impulse is another fantastic card against you as well versus both versions of the deck, but it can definitely cut off your engine in the Furniture version. I guess it's also hand trap version. And at the end of the day, you're just playing like a mid-range type deck. You're playing a deck similar to Centurion or Voiceless. I just think that like this deck still has a rough matchup over Snake Eyes. And you're still weak to the same cards that many other decks are also weak to. So like Impulse, for example, already mentioned. And you reopen yourself up to being weak to Valor and Imperm and Ariana. Ash still hurts you a ton. That I feel like the deck isn't great. Now, I think this deck's matchup in a Tempai is rather solid, and you can still definitely just hand trap Snake Eye opponents to death, but your non-engine count isn't like crazy high. And the worst part is like if they have Ashes and Impulses to shut down your engine, you actually scramble more in the grind game than they do, which is the kind of brutal part. And I think the non-trap version of Labyrinth actually struggles a lot more with Yubel, because now you actually are weak to cards like Phantom of Yubel that would otherwise not affect you at all. And it just leaves you in a terrible position. That being said, all I've done is shit on it. Not being weak to Furos is a huge upside. And when it goes first, it can be very strong still. It snowballs incredibly fast. Even games that feel like it's not doing anything super impressive, it's only hand rip one and then bounce. It sets up a lot of pressure. And once it gets the ball rolling, the advantage it kind of gathers feels unstoppable. So I don't want to kind of downplay how powerful the string of Labyrinth cards can be, especially versus decks that aren't super combo heavy, but even versus those, it can really hold its own for sure. It means that going first, it's fantastic, and going second, it can be good as well. Talking about Impulse against this deck is one thing, how Impulse is like good against it, but now this deck can also play Impulse, right? So you can now play Impulse, Ash, Furos as a core amount of good hand traps. Before, the amount of good hand traps were very limited, and then you can add other Imperm Valor on top, and the hand trap lineup becomes to look a lot more powerful in overall, in the average overall, I guess, strength. So still definitely not upgraded for this deck. I just don't think it'll be like crazy well positioned or anything. I think it's just like fine. It's a fine option. Next in this list, we've got Ritual Beast. This is a deck that I have pegged down from the last list. Being able to use Shifter is still super nice. However, I think this deck's weakness into Furos is pretty evident. I mean, your game plan is going to be similar to what it is in a lot of other matchups, and that is kind of like go for Canahawk, search Steeds, and hope that follow-up plus the pop is enough to get you there. And I mean, in some cases it can. It's like similar to Skyburn pop in that way, but I think what you lose in the Fire King engine is your ability to go second to removal, especially if Fire King is at all popular, and this one's like a little more iffy because I don't know how popular it'll be. But if Fire King is popular, then I think it's matched up into the pops, all the removal pieces like Kieran and Skyburn, and it's kind of rough. My problem with Ritual Beast, I've repeated several times again, is I don't like how it's weak into the first action removal, so like IP into SP. And where that was a little bit less common in the last format because Yubel only has Rage, then now like you just lose that. And yeah, I think it does leave Ritual Beast in a lot worse of a position. And obviously going first, like you are not as invincible as you might have been before. That being said, though, it's not terrible. Its core engine is still pretty strong. Still get to use Shifter, and you can definitely do some other things to make it work. I think D-Fissure is very good in this deck, and you can definitely play more of those now as ways of playing like slower under Furos. To go like D-Fissure plus Steeds Pass is a lot more impressive than just Steeds. So a card I'd like to see explored a little bit more in this deck. Next up on this list, I want to talk about Runic White Forest, or White Forest in general, but I guess you're in the context of White Forest. So Runic decks are something that Josh has talked about as being playable into Maxi, being a reason he brought it to the World Championship last year. It's not like the best deck into Maxi, but it is functional into Maxi. And the White Forest cards kind of are the same with Furos. Being able to chain a Runic spell to dodge a draw, Furos can be nice. A couple draws to get the Diabell and stuff your field is pretty good, as well as turboing through your deck. Finding Skill Drain is still incredibly powerful. That hasn't changed, and it leaves the Runic cards in an otherwise okay position. Now, my problem with Runic is the same one's been for a while, and I think even Josh will tell you this from last format, as going second with them can be kind of rough into decks like Yubel and Snake Eyes. I don't think it's well positioned. However, into more mid-range decks, if people are playing more Tempai, more Centurion, more Labyrinth, then the Runic cards get significantly stronger, because they actually can help you going second into half fields, as well as they protect you from destruction on some of these destruction heavy decks. And if that comes up, then this deck can actually have a proper win rate going second, and that will help you. As well as Furos could just cheese out games when you go first. Now Furos is way worse than Maxi in Runic, because Runic would draw into Maxi and then be able to use it there. Don't have the same luxury with Furos. You draw into it, it's like evenly matched, it's gonna be dead for the rest of the game, and you'll have to just throw it away. But unlike evenly matched, you can't discard it for a White Forest card, so it is worse. But even that leaves to be seen. Card is broken, still expect to see Furos everywhere, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. Next up is Pearly. I talked about this a little bit, but yeah, so if you go like back to Pearly spell, which means Furos, for one, like the Runics, you have another option of chaining a second spell to power through it, and you don't have to use a special summon effect on the first one, and you know that works. Or you can just let it go to Grave and it's like a Sleepy, then you can go like normal Black Cat and rank up. And because you're going to yeep on your opponent's turn a lot of the time, even if you do special from the deck and you rank up into Noir, giving your opponent 2 draws for you going into your end field or your boss monster, and by all means that's like pretty acceptable. So yeah, I think that deck is super functional into our max 3 here, and that is a huge edge to it. As well as the thing with Pearly is it's always been able to go second in some capacity. All your standards are spells, meaning you can play into fields, okay? And you can play a pretty extensive non-engine account, so you can kind of shape it around whatever the format needs, hand traps and such. Now the deck isn't invulnerable to the Maxi. 2 draws is still pretty good, still pot agreed. If you don't get to 5 materials, you are weak to breakers, so Tempai can kind of just rail you there, as well as some decks are able to extend past you. But I do think that Pearly does kind of improve in position from before, because you don't have to like callbys and crossouts, that nonsense. You can just let them draw 2, make a Noir that draws 4, and have cards like Ash, Veiler that keep them at bay with the format Noir. Next up is Voice's Voice, a deck that I always find terrible. And I've moved it up. It's in the neutral position because if Furos does like nothing to this. And where my problem with this deck in National is you get Maxi to still give your opponent a couple draws for a very like mediocre field. If you get Furos and you like virtual summon from the hand, you do 0. Like straight up, you do nothing, and like the draws don't matter at all. And like the draw nothing. And when you're trying to break through an Omni Negate, every single card matters, right? If that card could have baited the Omni Negate, it could have been the difference between you winning or losing the game. So Voices gets way better in that regard. Now, the way when you can get the draw is when you do the Diviner combo with Trias, give them a draw in that way, and then you also can't link. But 1 draw and then just doing the rest of the combo normally is still just fantastic. So I wouldn't go to say the combo is weak to Furos, just that it's weaker. My problem with the deck is still the same, where it feels bricky. If Barrier's in the format, that's going to kind of screw you. Going second is hard because your non-engine's actually kind of limited. And going first, you can still just get run over by combo decks that just have more power than you. And again, unlike Master Duel TCG, you can't back up your mediocre field with a Maxi. So I don't like this deck. I do think that it is better now than it was before. So for whatever that's worth, if you're a Voices fan, rejoice for now, because I'll give you a little bit. I'll give you a crumb. Next up is Rescue Ace. I think this deck is still neutrally positioned. You can arguably say it's a bit higher. This is a deck that I've always kind of dubbed the worst of the fire decks, and that hasn't changed. But it's still a fire deck with some incredible tools at its disposal. And as far as getting Furos goes, same with Maxi, you are able to access your Turbulence and set 4 a lot more reasonably and with less draws than other combos require. So you can argue that for sure it's better into those cards. Now I do still think that the deck's need for bricks and lack of as much ability to push through fields make it overall still just a worse deck, even if better into Furos. but it's not. I can't understate, like, it's still a fire deck. It's still a good deck. The last deck I have neutrally positioned is Kashtira. It's a pure cash deck I felt like is fine for a while, and I've talked about it many times. It seems that the Tempai matchup can be kind of brutal because your floodgates don't work against them. They'll just kind of knock through whatever you have. But your other matchups are pretty good. You have now another broken hand trap you can use 1 second to keep Snake Eyes and go at bay. Fenrir and Unicorn are broken into mid-range decks, as well as constant flow of value. And I still think you can play small fiends in the package in here to give you a little bit of gas to make cards like Caesar or Desiree live on top of everything. And without using a normal summon, you can play cards like the new Lacrima now and really expand upon that theory. Whether that needs to be played or whether that's accurate needs to be seen. But yeah, I mean, besides that, you still have access to Shifter, Defissure, just these broken cards that people mauled about all the time. So I think Cash is in a fine spot. Next up, we got the poorly positioned category. So decks that I feel like are not in a good spot. And the first one is Ironic, and then it's Mimigul. Read Dominus Impulse for a second, guys. I'm going to throw up on screen and give you guys 5 seconds. Tick tock, tick tock. Okay, did you notice the problem? All right, so I'm not talking about Mimigul using this card because obviously you can't use Earth Effects. However, if I'm playing versus a deck that plays Impulse, like Senpai, and they Impulse me and I give them Mimigul and it flips up, wait, your opponent can't activate that Mimigul effect now because they used Impulse. And womp womp womp, your deck sucks. Impulse is a fantastic card, and it'll be in any deck that can play it pretty much, even if it's just Fire King and Tempai and Labyrinth in the immediate sense. I think that immediately diminishes playability of Mimigul because you just have these like auto lose cards more than the Perulia, which or the Furos, which is so mental to me. They didn't even give Mimigul a chance to fly. It kind of just died on release immediately because of Impulse. Now, it's not the only factor. It has some decent power behind it, and the support from Rhoda was good, but its combos still aren't as good as other decks, and it's not like it excels in playing into hand traps or the Mulch armies. So I would be hard pressed to call this like an insane deck. Although it is very functional, it is one of the better TCG exclusive archetypes we've got in a while. And even though I'm saying it's poorly positioned, it's not like tier 10 Tistina nonsense. I'd put it like not that much farther below the decks than usually positioned. This deck just has pretty big glaring weaknesses and doesn't have like any crazy high redeeming quality to equalize it. Next up is Rika Plants, a deck that fluctuates a lot in my lists, partially because of my comprehension of it being very basic. I know what this deck does more than a lot of players apparently, but still not like the level that Jess or Julius have, where they just spam this shit nonstop. That being said, I can't imagine this is good in the maxi format, especially when you're playing a deck that wants to play 60 cards and you can't consistently draw into your anti-maxi options as much as you'd like to. So I think it leaves this deck just way worse off than it was before. I guess like the only like redeeming quality can be that now if there's mid-range decks, your breakers can work against them, but I don't know. Also, the Asmina cards being more omnis, kind of invalidating some of the breakers, kind of rough. Dominance Impulse is another fantastic hand trap against you, so I think this deck only lost from the last list, so I'm gonna keep it low. Now these next 3 decks are 3 mid-range decks that have both been pretty solid over the last few months to differing degrees, but I feel like it kind of obliterated now because of Furos. Marincess, Salamangreat, and Melodious. All fine decks with some decent potential in their own rights. One thing I've realized from playing Salad and Master Duel is Maxi just murders you. And Furos is the same here. These decks don't have much ability to chill under Furos, and Melodious is probably the best out of all of them in doing so, but still kind of rough in my opinion. That makes it like not desirable all to play these. Like these decks are already not the strongest engines. The fact that now you're losing just as hard, if not harder, than some of the decks like Snake Eye do to the new Maxi, it's just brutal. So I would never like recommend playing these decks in the modern circumstance. Next up on this list is Millennium. With the brand new support card, Heart of the Eyes of Blue, the deck is more consistent now, as well as you have another layer of interruption, especially with decks like Yubel, which have the high-level monsters that the new Blue Eyes can send. It's not enough to make the deck good. The deck was in the same spot before, that hasn't changed. Furos is not a huge problem for this deck, so like that's kind of nice, I guess, but the deck also doesn't really present much of a threat. And then it has a field nuke, which is fine. And if you back up with hand traps, it's not like the worst deck in the world, but it's just not as good as the other options. It's a fine deck. That's the truth. But it's not a tier 1 deck either. It's not meta. Last up, I got Memento as a poorly positioned deck here. And I was hyping this up as something I thought would be really good, but the Lacrima ban really hurt. And then I thought that with Rhoda, the new Goblin support cards would help out this deck. But truthfully, I think Furos hurts it more than it's been helped, because the deck is weak to Furos. You do summon a lot between the deck and the extra deck, and your half ward isn't anything spectacular. And other decks have only gotten better, and I think that leaves the deck kind of in the dust. Yeah, because I feel like you lost your engine, and we lost the Fiendsmith engine pretty much, and you don't have anything good to replace it with. And now you're weak to the new Mulch Army. So while I was a big Memento fan before, it's kind of just been feeling rough for me over the last little bit, and I think it got definitely collateral damage by the ban list more than I expected. Anyways, guys, that's it for now, and this is what the tier list looks like. This is where I feel we'll kind of stand as we approach in the new format. I'm curious if you guys have any different opinions to my own, if there's anything you move up or down, or if there's a deck I forgot, because it seems to be like a guarantee that I'll always forget one important deck, as well as I wonder if Niagara reflected my predictions remotely at all. That's gonna be it for now, guys. And if you're interested about seeing what I think the best staples are gonna be this format, it will be coming out soon, and we'll get a good in-depth deep dive into the format over the next few weeks as we break down different discussion topics. So with that, I'll see you all next time. Peace.